Welcome to my History 102 lecture, in-class lecture on the 1980s. The first individual we will talk about for the 1980s is Ronald Reagan, president for most of the 1980s. President Reagan was born in 1911 in Illinois. One of the more interesting stories about President Reagan is that he moved to Chicago as a child. His father was a salesman. Grew up in Chicago during the Great Depression. His family, Ronald Reagan, his memoirs later on talked about his and his family's support and like for Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, as many Americans at the time did. One of President Reagan's early jobs was a radio announcer. Some of the interesting stories from that era. One of President Reagan's first gigs as a radio personality, he would broadcast accounts of Chicago Cubs games. And what's interesting is, the interesting story is, he would get, somebody would call in to the radio station accounts of the game, like, who hit the ball, was it a single, double, the runs, and then President Reagan, as a young radio announcer, would have to fill in the details. And so that's one of the kind of early interesting stories about President Reagan. Growing up, one of his first jobs as a radio announcer is that kind of having to, fill in the gaps on Cubs baseball games that he would broadcast on a local radio station. As he got into his 20s, he went to Hollywood and to work and became an actor. And that's probably the most famous non-presidential thing that President Ronald Reagan is known for, as being an actor in around 40 films. The main part of his career was the 1930s and 40s. Even though he's on TV in the 50s, his last movie was in 1966, right before he became governor of California. So he was in movies in the 50s and 60s a little bit, but the heyday of his career, the main glory days of his career, was the 1930s and 40s. During World War II, President Reagan did training films for the Army. And this kind of has led to kind of some myths about, like, President Reagan in the military. He's in training films for the Army as he's an actor. And so during World War II, he did a lot of training movies for World War II, for the military in World War II. And so that's kind of led to some, people who served in the military, he was in military films. And that's kind of where, his military service was, he's an actor in the movies. And so that's kind of his World War II service. The issue with him being an actor around that time period, when World War II happened, his career was kind of taking off. Like, President Reagan kind of developed the reputation of kind of being you had the leading man. He was always the guy, the next guy. So you'd have the leading man in the movie, and he would always kind of be the B character, the next male character. And so World War II kind of interrupted his attempt to kind of move into the leading man roles. When he came back from World War II, Hollywood culture kind of moved on, and so he kind of struggled in movies after World War II. In the 50s, he kind of reinvented himself as a TV host for a company called General Electric. It was a little, how TV was done in the 50s is a little bit different than today. Like today we have networks, right, that pay for shows. And you have sponsors in it. Yeah, people pay to put their companies pay to put their commercials on a TV show. What happened in the 50s, though, in the 1950s, how a TV show is done, a TV show, before it was made, or at the time it was made, needed to have a sponsor. In other words, a company would pay for the show. So not just to advertise on the show, but actually like pay for the show. So, for example, one of the more famous TV shows in the 1950s was called General Electric Theater. So what that was you had a company, General Electric, a large American company, paid for a TV show to be put on. So like today, they just advertise, in between during the show. But back then, in the 50s, you actually paid for a show. You sponsored it. So for example, a lot of times a show might die, not because people didn't watch it, but if a company didn't sponsor it, didn't pay for it, wouldn't go on. So TV shows ran a little bit differently than today. And so that's why in the 1950s, President Reagan became kind of the host of a show called the General Electric Theater. The company, the electric company, manufacturing appliance company, General Electric, paid for a program. General Electric Theater was like a variety show. They'd have skits, musicians, comedy acts, drama pieces, little plays, musicians, actors, magicians, people would come on and kind of do a little variety show, different, juggler, then a comedy show, and then whatever entertains people. And President Reagan was the host of that. So, 30s and 40s, a movie star. After World War II, he kind of reinvents himself as kind of a TV host. For those of you interested in Nevada history, President Reagan actually did a couple-week variety show in the early 50s here in Vegas at the what used to be called the New Frontier. So President Reagan has a Las Vegas entertainment connection. In the 1960s, President Reagan kind of moves into politics. His movie career, his career's kind of over. The General Electric Theater has ended. He's not really, coveted as an actor to see movies. He does appear in the movie in the mid-60s. That's his last one, 1966. It turned out it was a horror movie. I can't remember it. I should, but it was a horror movie right before he got elected California governor. So in the 60s, he kind of becomes a political candidate and speaker. And then he's governor of California from 1967 to 1975. And so, kind of an actor that kind of moved into politics. President Reagan's political journey is a kind of an interesting study. His family were supporters of the New Deal and FDR. President Reagan writes, President Reagan liked FDR. No one's perfect, but President Reagan loved FDR. FDR was very popular in the 30s and 40s and after. President Reagan writes later in his memoirs of kind of his political journey. One of his famous sayings is he always would say, I didn't leave the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party left me. Okay. And that should be familiar to you. We talked about in class the New Left. We talked about that, the 60s, the New Left. The Democrat Party had become much more statist, much more pro-Marxist, much more, pushing social change in some ways. I hate to use the word extreme, but push social change more and more. Kind of challenge the social order more and more violently and more emphatically sometimes. One perspective would say call it extreme. I hesitate to use the word. If you want to be overly, you have to explain what extreme is. But that's kind of what President Reagan meant when he said, I didn't leave the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party left me. And that's kind of when we talked about the New Left movement in the 60s. Kind of gives you that idea of political radicalism. You have to explain what radicalism is, but kind of explain that. And so Ronald Reagan, by the mid-60s, is a voice of American conservative politics and ideology. He's a supporter of Barry Goldwater. two of the speeches you'll be watching for your second writing assignment are from the 60s, from that era, where President Reagan is, not president yet, he's just a speaker, but where President Reagan is arguing for the Barry Goldwater campaign, kind of arguing for modern American conservatism. And a lot of his critiques, when you watch the second writing assignment video, a lot of his critiques are of that new left. And that's what he's critiquing. Governor of California. So in the last class, the end of the last lecture, we got him elected. I took out this slide for the 80 election because we talked about it already in the 70s. But President Reagan wins the election in 1980, and what's his famous slogan? Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And for a lot of political scientists and historians, that really cements his victory. When you ask the American people, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And unfortunately, every politician has used it since. So today, it's kind of like tired and boring. But back then, it was kind of a new thing. A little tidbit that people like to bring up today. Guess what another slogan in the 1980 election was for the Reagan campaign? Make America Great. And so, the Trump campaign in 2016, Make America Great, again. That was actually also used in 1980 by the President Reagan's campaign, Make America Great Again. And so it's a little bit of a kind of a blast from the past. 1980, the Reagan campaign also used the slogan "Make America Great Again," and the Trump campaign in 2016 kind of rebranded that, brought it back, so to speak. And in 2016, that's what a lot of the Trump campaign, that's what they asked a lot about in 2016. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Kind of writing the tales of the chaos of the last few previous years. And so the Reagan administration, the Reagan campaign, kind of the same thing. Are what has the Carter administration done for you other than destroy your wages, destroy your job, destroy America's standing in the world, destroy the economy, inflation, and all that jazz. So the Carter administration gets hit pretty hard. Soft on communism, weak on the world stage, inept, Iran hostage crisis, the economy's not good, just bad. If you remember the last class, I showed you the map of Reagan's victory in 1980. It was pretty solid, right? It was like, oh my gosh. So we now get into the Reagan administration. One of the more famous aspects of the Reagan administration are his economic policies, called Reaganomics. Okay? Reaganomics had several features to it. Number one, lowering taxes. That's the Tax Reform Act of 1981. I'll give you an example. The top tax bracket in 1979 was around 90%. So the top tax bracket, they're paying 90% of their income in taxes. The Tax Reform Act cuts that to 39%. So 90 to 39. Okay. Roughly 90 to about 39%. That is a tax break. The argument is what? The argument is what people will do. What people will do with those tax cuts is put it into the economy, buying things. The top tax bracket are people that create create jobs, build jobs, create companies, create products. Get the economy moving. And so these lower taxes give entrepreneurs the opportunity to, rather than giving it to a government that will most likely waste it, will then use that money to create jobs, build factories, invest in companies, buy things as well. And so you lower taxes so people can spend more of their own money. Cut government spending. The Reagan administration argued that, limited government. One of President Reagan's more famous sayings is, government is not the solution to the problem, government is the problem. And so the Reagan administration had a program wanting to cut government spending on social programs, wasteful programs like, millions of dollars to the National Endowment of the Arts, which often produce pornography. I mean, what is the purpose of all these things? Pork barrel spending, money spent on studies that don't really matter. So cut government spending, deregulation. One of the arguments of the Reagan administration is one of the problems, one of the reasons that the 1970s economy was so sluggish was that government was oppressing. Government was over-regulating the economy, thus causing businesses, rather than going out and making money and producing jobs and products, was too worried about what the government's going to do to them. And so the Reagan administration was also big on deregulation, cutting government regulating industries. The two most famous are the airline industry and the savings and loan industry. I don't really talk about it a lot, but you can read about it in your book. In the late 80s, you have what's called the savings and loan scandal. The Reagan administration deregulating the banking industry is kind of blamed for part of that savings and loan issues later in the decade. That's debatable, but certainly if you relax rules or change rules, it does have unintended consequences. So deregulation, but the argument is, you allow companies to go out and do what they do best. Create jobs, build factories, get people to work, rather than worrying about government on your back regulating it. To tell you that one reason you like me is the whole story, and so again, like I mentioned, in the late 80s, you had a bunch of savings and loan scandals in the late 80s. And I actually remember them as a kid. I was a teenager. I remember those. It was like banks just all of a sudden started failing. The Reagan administration deregulating a lot of these savings and loan industry is partially to blame for that. Funny story. We're not going to talk about Clinton in this class because I didn't get to it, but what's kind of funny is one of the many Bill Clinton scandals involves a savings and loan, like the same era. So in a weird way, Bill Clinton can almost get mad at Ronald Reagan and the Reagan administration deregulating the savings and loan industry because one of the many Bill and Hillary Clinton scandals was a savings and loan in Arkansas, and so they actually got involved in a fraudulent one, and so anyway, so the Clintons were either unknowing victims of the savings and loan scandal or they participated in fraud, and so that's kind of the debate with Bill Clinton. But anyways, so the deregulation, back to, you have the Reagan administration trying to deregulate the economy. The argument is, companies will go out and they'll expand and they won't have to worry about government rules too much. Defense spending. The Reagan campaign in 1980 argued that they were going to fight the Cold War again. The Carter administration, even the Nixon administration, the Reagan campaign didn't just critique Carter, but they critiqued Nixon and they critiqued Ford as soft on communism, inept at containing the communists, the Soviets. And in previous lectures with Nixon and Carter, we went over that. It appears that the détente policy was helping the Soviets expand, right? The Reagan administration argued to have increased defense spending. Defense budgets during the Reagan administration are going to, some years, by the end of it, quadruple. defense spending skyrockets during the Reagan administration. What was supposed to happen was social spending, like other spending, was supposed to drop, so defense spending it was supposed to balance out. The problem is Democrats controlled Congress for most of Reagan's 8 years, and so President Reagan was never really able to cut a lot of spending over here, but he was able to massively increase defense spending. And so the downside of that was, by the end of the 80s, you had a massive deficit, a massive budget deficit, because what ended up happening, the Reagan administration, kind of the negative side, never really cut spending over here. But you ballooned defense spending, and so it leads to massive budgets. So, when we talk about conservative economics, you're supposed to limit government and cut spending. It is a mixed bag for the Reagan administration. Massive defense spending, but not really cutting over here, so it doesn't balance out. They both go up. And so it does lead to some massive spending. In fact, President Reagan, in his 1989 farewell speech in January of 1989, he kind of did a farewell speech to the nation. He'd been president 8 years, very popular. He gave a farewell speech to the country, and he mentions the deficit as one of his failures. He kind of blew the budget, and he admits that in his kind of farewell address to the nation. He actually talks about that, where his administration never really successfully cut spending on the social side, welfare, corruption, wasteful spending. But you balloon defense spending, and it blows the budget out of the water. And so he actually says that's one of his failures of his presidency. Some people, fans of Ronald Reagan, he did nothing wrong. But a balanced view, that's why you like me. A balanced view is kind of blow the budget, right? They're not fiscally conservative. Let's look at some other first-term issues. On March 30th, 1981, President Reagan actually has an assassination attempt. You can actually YouTube the video. There's video of the assassination attempt. And if you notice, very early in his presidency, right? The 1980 election was the previous November. President Reagan took office on January 20th, 1981. So, this is just a couple months into his presidency. John Hinckley wanting to impress an actress, Jodie Foster. Fine actress. I love Jodie Foster. Fantastic. I actually have a sister-in-law that looks like Jodie Foster. But anyways, fun story there. But he does have an assassination attempt that he survives. And, interesting, like polls at the time, it actually kind of increases his popularity for a while. We talk about a honeymoon period, presidents get elected, then they have a honeymoon period before everyone hates them. President Reagan kind of enjoys a bump of support after he got assassinated and he survived. Because when you think about it, right, Kennedy got killed, right? Gerald Ford actually had 2 assassination attempts on him, which is kind of funny. He's a nice guy, like, what did he do wrong? But anyways, President Reagan had 2 significant Supreme Court additions. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman in the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor's from Arizona. I remember as a kid, like in second grade, third grade, somewhere in there, 2nd grade, like we had this big lesson on Sandra Day O'Connor. She's from Arizona, where I grew up, and so when she got called to the Supreme Court, so President Reagan has the first woman on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. Sandra Day O'Connor, she ends up being kind of a center, a middle of the road. You couldn't really put her in the conservative liberal paradigm that we want, box that we want to shove everyone into. Then Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia, you could argue judicially, probably one of the most conservative, ideologically conservative, original intent justices in the 20th and 21st century. So he's kind of controversial to some people. If you're more progressive politically, ideologically, people hate his guts because he actually believed in following the Constitution. How dare he? But anyway, so he believed in what was called original intent, and so Scalia he always went back to what did the founders intend, original intent. So, and we've kind of gone over progressivism, so you can see immediately why somebody that's progressive ideologically would hate his guts, right? Somebody's progressive ideologically, no, get rid of the Constitution, no, it's old, it's stuff, it's stupid, ignore it, blah, blah, blah. We should be able to do whatever we want. Let's rip the Constitution to shreds. And so Antonin Scalia, for progressively political people, he's hated because, how dare he want to follow a revered document, the U.S. Constitution. More conservative ideological people love him because he adhered to the foundation of our society, the U.S. Constitution. He adhered to our founding documents. He had respect, for the traditions that made our country what it is today, a great country. A country that's lasted for 200 years. So Antonin Scalia is controversial to some, to others he's not. But he is big on this idea of original intent. You want to remember that word. Original intent. What did the founders want? What did the founders want? So, there is a recession. President Reagan's re-election in 84 was not a shoo-in. In 82, you have a recession, sharp economic downturn. Reagan critics, more progressive historians, blame Reaganomics, tax cut, deregulation, and stuff like that. A more balanced view is kind of left over from the 70s. You're trying to change policies from the 70s, so there'll be some issues. So there's a recession in 82. Historians generally blame the 1981 tax cuts and deregulation. I personally, I'm more charitable towards Reaganomics, so I think as your policies could cause some upset. I think you're kind of giving a shock to the system. So, but anyway, so I'm not as critical as other historians on that. But I don't like a lot of U.S. historians don't like Ronald Reagan quite a bit. I'm on the other side more, and so I'm a little more charitable in my interpretations of it. The next one, fighting communism. Afghanistan and Nicaragua. These are big deals. We're gonna go into detail on those, Afghanistan and Nicaragua. They kind of come to define the Reagan administration foreign policy wise. Okay, so his first term. So let's talk about Afghanistan. Okay, so Afghanistan, we talked about it already. Afghanistan, before the 70s, had a pro-Western anti-communist government. That government gets kicked out of power in the mid-70s, and a pro-Soviet communist government takes over. Okay. And the last lecture, I put 78 on the slide. It's 79. It's December of 79 is what it is. I need to go back and change that. But December of 79, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to support their communist government. And remember when we talked about in class about the 70s, that plot should be familiar to you. A country invades another country to support a government it likes. That we just went over that. Vietnam, right? A lot of historians call Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Right? A pro-Soviet government takes power. That pro-Soviet government is losing their war. all the anti-communist, other groups, all these groups have come together in Afghanistan to try to kick out this communist government. So what do the Soviets do? They invade, right, to support their government, the government that they like. What's Carter do? Carter looks in that all we do is boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics. Okay. Held in Moscow. The Reagan administration is going to get us a lot more involved in Afghanistan. The CIA in the early 80s, the CIA begins a program to help what's called the Mujahideen. Mujahideen is Arabic for freedom fighters. So in Afghanistan, anyone fighting the Soviet invasion and that pro-communist government was called the Mujahideen. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Anyone fighting the Soviets and or the communist government was called the Mujahideen. So you had all kinds of different groups, Afghan warlords, Pakistani Muslim students, Arab people from all of the Arab world, Muslim people from Muslim soldiers all over the Arab world, Muslim world were coming to Afghanistan to fight. And so what the CIA does is the CIA is like, okay, we have a ton of money and a ton of weapons. We're going to go help the Mujahideen. Who are the Mujahideen? Like everyone. If you were, all you had to do was say, I'm fighting the Soviets or the government, the government in Afghanistan, the pro-communist government. And so it's kind of a loose title, just like everyone's Mujahideen, and so the U.S. government, so the CIA goes in with tons of cash and tons of weapons and just starts handing it out to anyone. Just anyone. Stinger missiles is the most common weapon that they handed out. What a Stinger missile is, it's a shoulder-fired missile system that could shoot down Soviet rockets, or Soviet helicopters, sorry. Because Soviet helicopters, you just sat on your shoulder. So somebody would load the rocket, the little rocket missile, they'd load it in, and you could just sit on your shoulder and fire it. And you could take out a Soviet helicopter. Okay? So the Carter administration doesn't do anything. They're like, I don't know. The Reagan administration's like, no, we're going to fight the Cold War. Okay, this is fighting the Cold War again. Reagan is a critic of détente. Reagan doesn't like détente. We're going to go back to containing the communists, right? I need to talk about this. Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden, he may be receding from our memory today. He's been dead for a long time, but, a little about Osama bin Laden. He's been famous for the last 20 years. Okay? I need to help you. There's this myth that the CIA created and helped Osama bin Laden. That is not correct. Okay? So what is the truth? What's accurate about that story? It's not completely false. It's not completely false, but it's not, like I've seen things on social media like that, like we recruited bin Laden and he was our guy, and that's not correct. So that's not correct. But but there is some truth to it, so I need to go over that. So who is Osama bin Laden? Osama bin Laden was the son of a wealthy Saudi billionaire, the bin Laden family. They're still a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, the bin Laden family. It's a large family. The dad had like 30 wives and 50 kids. It's a wealthy family still, in Saudi Arabia today. So this guy bin Laden, Osama bin Laden is the son of this wealthy billionaire in Saudi Arabia. Okay. When the Mujahideen starts, when the Soviets invade Afghanistan, people from all over the Muslim/Arab world go go to Afghanistan to fight what would be called a jihad or a holy war. We've got to fight the Soviets. We're fighting the Soviets. The Soviets are godless atheists. The communists are godless atheists, right? So we're going to fight this jihad or holy war, crusade. Well, crusade is Christian, I guess, but it's holy war. And so Osama bin Laden, he's the son of a wealthy billionaire. He has all this money. So what Osama bin Laden does, he's a young man in his 20s. He wants adventure. He wants to fight. He wants to fight for the cause. He takes his money, some of his father's money and his money, and he goes to Afghanistan, and he creates a group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is it's an Arabic word meaning the base. So his Al-Qaeda group is a group of Arab fighters and Pakistani fighters too, all over the Arab world. They're fighting this Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda means it's Arabic for the base. So this is Osama bin Laden's group. He has all this money. He gets weapons. Okay. So it is correct that the CIA is in Afghanistan in the early 80s, indiscriminately handing out money and weapons to whoever. Okay. So is it possible that bin Laden's group got some of these money and weapons? Yeah. The CIA is handing it out like candy. Okay. It's doubtful that bin Laden would have gone out of his way to accept help from the U.S. Because even in his early 20s, Osama bin Laden, when you study Osama bin Laden, even at that early age, he hated America, he hated Israel, he hated America's support for Israel. It is doubtful that he would have gotten in bed with his hated enemy, Zionist, Great Satan Americans. Okay. Now, is it possible, though, in that environment of Afghanistan, there's a war, the CIA is just handing out the money and weapons? Is it possible some people associated with Osama bin Laden got money and weapons? Yeah. So the CIA was just handing it out. Just didn't ask questions. Okay. So it is, while I'm, I'm not a conspiracy theory hater. For me, sometimes conspiracy just means you know the truth before everyone else. But I think this is an instance where the conspiracy theory goes too far. The CIA did not create Osama bin Laden. He was not a CIA informant and operative. Is it possible though that CIA money and weapons got into the hands of Al-Qaeda? Yeah, sure. Okay. The CIA wasn't keeping track of who they were giving. All you had to do was say, I'm Mujahideen. Okay. Here's your money. And here's your weapons. So I need to clear that up for you. Okay. The conspiracy theory goes way too far into not being correct or accurate. Again, that's why you like me. I give you the full story. Is it completely false? No. Could Osama bin Laden and his fighters gotten their hands on American weapons and money to help fight the Soviets? Sure, yeah. I mean, the CIA was indiscriminate. They didn't care who they gave money. So anyway, so there's that. Next. So you need a ship to Nicaragua. So we're going to leave Afghanistan where it is. You have the CIA just pouring money and weapons into this conflict, right? So we're just, we're helping. So we're helping the Mujahideen. And I remember as a kid learning that word. Like, I knew the word in elementary school. We'd learn it in school. Who are the Mujahideen? So I remember learning that word in school, kind of like who they were. So let's go to Nicaragua. So Nicaragua is a Central American country. Okay. In 1978, a pro-U.S. anti-communist Somoza regime gets overthrown by a left-wing group called the Sandinistas. Okay. So before 78, Nicaragua had a pro-U.S. government. Pro-Western, pro-U.S., anti-communist. They would throw communists from the helicopters, like take a commie up in a helicopter and push them out. So very anti-communist. 78, a group of left-wingers, and why I'm saying left-wing, there is a debate, and it does kind of determine kind of where you are on the political spectrum. So I'm saying left-wing to be a little more neutral. The Reagan administration called them communists, right? More progressive historians, and progressive of the people at the time, they were just freedom fighters. They're just fighting for the freedom of their people. So, there's some debate about, right? So I'm saying left wing just to, it's a little more neutral term. They are left on the political spectrum, so I'm let you you decide how communist they were, I guess. So you have the Sandinistas. They're a left-wing group. Some of the stories that come out of it, out of this era, you had stories of Sandinistas rounding people up and massacring them. The Contras, you have stories of Contras rounding people up and massacring them. So you get some pretty sad stories, like different groups would go after people they didn't like. The media focuses on kind of the non-left-wingers going after the left-wingers and how horrible it is. They tend to ignore what the Sandinistas did. The Sandinistas rounded people up and shot them too. But the media and progressive historians tend to kind of ignore that. There are, you'll see in the media, right-wing death squads. I remember the kids seeing it. Yes, the Contras kind of were opposing them. Yeah, they did sometimes shoot people. The Sandinistas did too, and so, again, why you like me is I'm a little more balanced. And so, let's not ignore, one side in favor of the other just because we like them. Kind of a thing. So there are death squads. Those are some of the more famous stories from this area of death squads roaming around. So the Contras form. They fight the Sandinistas. So who are the Contras? So this is another issue. Just like the Mujahideen, the Mujahideen is this wide range of just anyone fighting the Soviets or anyone that wants CIA money. But anyway, same thing here. The Contras are anyone opposing the group, the Sandinistas. And so this is where another issue where it gets a little murky. Who are the Contras? Just about everyone. So there are legitimate, pro-Somoza supporters, anti-communists, and this gets a little bit into conspiracy theory, but it is true. It is true that sometimes drug cartels in Central America would get involved in the conflict. And so that's kind of where we'll talk about it more later. But you do have stories of the CIA giving money to Contras, and some of them are drug dealers. And so that's where you get into that kind of murky kind of who are you in bed with kind of a thing. I'll talk more about that later, but so that is true, and again, that's why you like me. Is I give the full story. There are unsavory people on both sides, and so for the Contras, that is true that it's legitimate anti-communist people that want the communists out, right? And there are some more seedy individuals like drug cartels. And when I was a kid, just to let you know, when I was a kid, that was a conspiracy theory. Today, it's documented. Yeah, there are drug cartels and the Contras helping, and then they were selling drugs in the U.S. So, 1982, the Boland Amendment. Oh, sorry, with the Reagan administration, the CIA the CIA starts supplying money and weapons to the Contras, and again, it is correct. The CIA is rather indiscriminate in who they hand out money and weapons to. It is true that some of the money and weapons do end up in the hands of people that are, but like the FBI. The FBI is going after them for being drug dealers. The CIA is, helping them fight the Sandinistas. And so that's going to get into some murky politics and law enforcement. So anyway, so that is true, correct. And so, whatever. Anyway, so the Boland Amendment, Democrats passed making it illegal to help the Contras. Democrats in Congress are worried that the Reagan administration is going to get us involved in another Vietnam. And so you have the Boland Amendment. That war will spill into Honduras and El Salvador, the two neighboring countries. You have Nicaragua. The war spills into Honduras and El Salvador. For example, the Contras would operate out of bases in Honduras and El Salvador and attack. And so what would the Sandinistas do? The Sandinistas would go into those two and start fighting. So you have the Honduran and the El Salvador government going, hey, so the war starts spilling into the region. Okay. CIA and drugs, I kind of already talked about this. In the 80s, the CIA fueled the cocaine boom in the U.S. during the 80s. I think that's going too far. I think that's going way too. I think it's going too far. But what is the reality of it? The CIA did at times work with groups. If you were anti-communist and fighting the Contras, fighting the Sandinistas or opposing communists, the CIA would work with you. So there are examples of drug dealers and drug cartels working with the CIA because why? Because the drug cartels they're opposing communists. Okay, so it is a weird circle. You have U.S. law enforcement fighting the war on drugs, while the CIA is helping some Central American drug cartel, like with money and weapons. Okay. If you guys want to watch one of the more famous shows in the 80s, Miami Vice, the whole show deals with that. The whole premise of Miami Vice are two Miami police officers, detectives, fighting that type of a war. Like one famous scene, the two main characters, Crockett and Tubbs, they've arrested a drug dealer in Miami. They're taking him to jail. Guess who shows up at the airport? The FBI saying, take the handcuffs off of him. One of the more famous scenes in that show are these two police officers. They've arrested a drug dealer. And the FBI comes up and says, no, he's our guy. Well, CIA. CIA agents come and say, he's with us. And so Miami Vice, the whole premise of the Miami Vice show is this theme of you're fighting the war on drugs, but the CIA is helping some of them. Because why? They're fighting the who? They're fighting the Contras. They're fighting communism in the Soviet Union. In Nicaragua. Okay. In 1984 re-election, the Democrats nominate Walter Mondale. Republicans nominate Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's 84 campaign was called Morning in America. The recession in 82-83 had abated. Deregulation began to help the economy grow. Low tax cuts began to help the economy grow. So Reaganomics started working. And we have a boom that lasts until about the year 2000. So the Reagan campaign, 4 years earlier it was, are you better off 4 years ago than you were today? Well, here, Morning in America, you have, you are better off today than you were 4 years ago. So you have the Morning in America campaign. It does work. Reagan wins re-election massively. Okay. I'm going to move this on quickly, but you can pause if you want to look at the results a little more closely. Okay. The next slide I'm going to talk about is Iran-Contra. Okay. So this is already getting to be a 50-minute video, but so I'm going to introduce the background to Iran-Contra, then we'll stop, and I'll have to do a second part, just so it's not a 4-hour video. So, background to Iran-Contra. The U.S. State Department under Reagan has declared Iran a terrorist state. Okay? So we are enemies with Iran, or at least the Iranian government. Okay? Okay. We have already declared Iran a terrorist state. Okay, so Iran's a terrorist state, right? The Islamic Revolution. Terrorism is in the 80s. There is terrorism in the 80s. Groups like Hezbollah and PLO, they hijack planes and kidnap journalists in the Middle East. Reagan's famous statement about these hostage crises is that we don't negotiate with terrorists. Okay, we're not going to negotiate with terrorists. Okay. Hezbollah is it's Arabic for Army of God. Lebanon in the early 80s is where they operated. Hezbollah is an Iranian-backed, still exists today. It's an Iranian-backed group. You know, either terrorist group or freedom fighters, depending on how you look at it. But they're a terrorist group. So for example, I would identify them as a terrorist group. I would call them freedom fighters. But anyways, so you have a terrorist group, Hezbollah, Army of God. They operate out of Lebanon. One of their biggest kidnappings during the early 80s was the CIA station chief in Lebanon. They kidnapped him. Okay, that's pretty crazy. So Jimmy Carter had a hostage crisis. Ronald Reagan had a hostage crisis too. You had all these terrorists in the Middle East kidnapping people, journalists, and they even capture a CIA station chief, a spy, and held them hostage. So, and then in Nicaragua, we just talked about the 1982 Boland Amendment. You got to make sure you know that. It makes it illegal for the U.S. to help in Nicaragua. The Contras start losing their war, thanks to Democrats in Congress cutting off support. The Contras start losing their war against the communist regime, the Sandinistas. The next part 2, we'll finish it.